Good morning, depending on where you're joining from today. My name is Eric Kimberling. Thanks for joining us. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world reach their third stage of digital transformation success. Excited to be live with you again here today. This is a live stream that we conduct every Tuesday at this same time to discuss all things related to digital transformation. And I'm going to introduce our guest here in just a moment. But before I do, just want to share with you what the topic is here today. Today, we wanted to talk about enterprise software selection best practices. Just what are some of the tips and lessons we've learned working with our clients over the years? What are some takeaways that you can take to your organizations in terms of evaluating and selecting potential software solutions? And what some of the pitfalls are, what some of the things to be thinking about are all. So that's all stuff we're going to cover here today. And we've got a great panel with you today, who I'm going to introduce in just a moment. So I encourage the audience to ask whatever questions you have along the way. If you could just drop in the chat any questions as you think of them at any point. We'll keep an eye on that chat across all the platforms we're streaming to, and we'll get to those questions as soon as possible. We are streaming to LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, as well as Twitch. So thank you for being here today. Thanks for joining. And this interview that we're doing here today, or this panel discussion, is actually going to become part of our Transformation Ground Control podcast, which is a podcast we release new episodes of every Wednesday. So a week from tomorrow, the episode of Transformation Ground Control will feature this interview. So you're getting to be part of sort of the live production of our podcast, or at least a major portion of our podcast. So thank you for being here today. Before I introduce our guest, one last thing. If you could just drop in the chat where you're joining from today. We'd love to hear where our global audience and our global community is joining us from here today. We usually get people all over the place, so we'd love to hear what city and country you're joining us from here today, if you don't mind. So with that being said, I wanted to introduce our guests here today, our panelists for today's discussion. We have with me first is Greg Benton, who's our Chief Strategy Officer. And Greg, thank you for being here today.
Hey, great to be here, and a very important topic to discuss today. So looking forward to it.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here. We also have Nate Stroeher, who is our practice lead here at Third Stage Consulting in the U.S. Nate, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Eric. And just like Greg said, excited to talk about these topics and have a lot of real world experience over the last 3 or 4 months. So we've got a lot of great stuff to discuss today.
Absolutely. And you've done your fair share of software selection. So I'd be curious to get your feedback as well as Greg's and Wayne Holtham, who is our Executive Vice President in charge of our Third Stage Asia Pacific office, who handles all of Asia Pacific and is based out of Brisbane, Australia. So Wayne, thanks for being here today, or this evening.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And software selection is the starting point. And one thing that's very dear to my heart, in the sense of if you do it right, you get a great outcome.
Right. Absolutely. And then we also have just joining us, I'm not sure if he's on the feed or not, but Khalid Morris, who's our Director of Strategy and Transformation here in our U.S. office. Khalid, welcome to the show, assuming you're connected.
I am connected. It's good to be here. I'll be on camera here in a second. I just have to transition computers because this one isn't working. So give me a sec there, but happy to be here.
Thanks for being here. And in the meantime, it'll be a mystery of what Khalid actually looks like. So we'll leave the audience guessing. We'll leave them on their toes here while we get started. So thank you all for being here, and thanks everyone for chatting or dropping in the chat where you're joining from today. Looks like we've got a great turnout here from everywhere from Atlanta, Georgia to Winnipeg, Canada, Grand Junction, Colorado, Oxford, UK, Sydney, Australia, Toronto, Canada, Kuwait, Argentina. So great audience representation from really all over the world. And I'm sure there's others that haven't mentioned where they're from as well on the line here today. So today's topic, as we mentioned, is to talk about software selection, software evaluation. How do you find the best software for your organization? How do you evaluate the technology? What are some of the pitfalls? What should we be thinking about? All that stuff is really what we want to get you to here today. And again, if you in the audience have questions related to evaluating technology, selecting technology, general trends within the software space, anything along those lines, please feel free to chime in at any point here. We're watching the chat as we go. So I guess just to start, I wanted to start and set the context here by kicking things off with a general question for Wayne. And that question is, why is a software selection process so important in general? If we just sort of start there.
That's a really good question, Eric, because I suppose for many organizations, it's the first time they get a chance to reset the way they do things. And technology is one of those things that allows them to be able to do things a different way, operate differently, improve the way they operate. And that software selection, if we do it right, it allows us to reset what we need for the context we're actually in, and allows us to be able to then work with changing our business up to the point of meeting what we require today and what we're going to need for the future. Because software isn't just a thing we buy and then it lasts. It's around with us for a number of years, and so it's one of those areas that's, to me, is the reset. And if we look at everything that's changed in our business, what we want to achieve in our business, starting with good software selection that's that point.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it sort of sets the trajectory for a transformation for sure. It sets you on a path towards that transformation, and obviously getting that path right and making sure it's aligned with your needs is such an important thing.
Yeah, and it may well be the trigger that people need to actually do that change, but it definitely is one of those things that's a good thing to start off with the view of where you're going to end up, sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Greg, Nate, or Khalid, anything you'd add to that as far as why the selection process is so important itself?
Well, I think that I'd like to weigh in a little bit. We're looking at making a digital transformation for most organizations that's going to happen once in every decade, right? So you want to make sure that you get it right, that you go into this with the right idea, the right objectives for the organization, clearly laid out, expressed to the rest of the folks that are coming along for the initiative, and then enter into a selection process with the idea that that's going to lead to a thoughtful, careful, well-planned deployment. And all of that continues to extend across the implementation, and then the post-go live support and ongoing. So all of it is a single continuum, and not to forget that. Yeah,
it's a great point. Rather than viewing it necessarily as discrete, separate milestones or separate activities, they're all interrelated, and certainly it's an ongoing journey for sure.
Right.
Yeah, great. So Nate, why don't I turn it to you for a second and ask, it sounds simple enough as we talk about selecting and evaluating software. If you haven't done it a lot before, or if you're not familiar with all the options out there in the marketplace, choosing software sounds easy enough on the surface, at least. But what are some of the common pitfalls that organizations face when they go through this process, and some of the challenges we should be aware of?
I think probably the top two that are the best to discuss today. Number one is underestimating the effort it takes to select a software. The folks that you traditionally will get involved in this process are going to be some of the more valuable resources to the organization. They're going to be likely very busy. They're going to be pulled in a lot of different directions. And it's really important that you make sure that when you're going through not only this process, but the whole digital transformation process, that you're realistic about the amount of resources you'll be able to donate to the project. And then also making it clear to the software vendors that are coming in and helping you to make this selection that what your expectations are and what your timeline is. Consider holidays, consider year-end close, month-end closed for most organizations. And you also likely are making changes to other platforms as well. So it's really important to sit down and get a really clear, realistic view of what your timeline is, what your resources are, and what you expect from the software vendors, and clearly convey that to them. I think that's really the most important. And then second of all, I think it's really important to know that that this is probably one of the most important decisions you're going to make. Like Greg mentioned earlier, probably every 10 years you'll be doing this, if not longer. So it's really important that you choose the right software, but you're never going to get the perfect software. And I think I've seen over the years organizations that will sit down and they'll extend this selection process from what should normally be about a 2 to 3 month process into a 6 to 7 month process, because they're just always trying to get that perfect fit. And there's never going to be a perfect fit. If you can really get 9 out of 10 of your requirements fully met, you've definitely found the right software.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. That organizations oftentimes get lost in analysis paralysis when they consider all of their options. If you were to just go Google top enterprise technology, top ERP systems, top HCM, CRM, whatever it is you're looking for, you'd find tons of options. And if you go down each rabbit hole of analyzing all these different options, a lot of them, by the way, are options that probably aren't good fits for your organization. But if you don't know that, you can waste a lot of time and resources on that. Back to your point, Nate. So I think that's a great point, that you want to be efficient about it, and also be realistic about how long it's going to take and what the resources are that are there. What are your thoughts, Greg and Wayne? Any additional thoughts there in terms of common challenges or pitfalls with the software evaluation process?
I think one of the things is that people, you mentioned the Google search of software. There's lots of brands out there. There's lots of marketing. Marketing doesn't necessarily mean you're buying the best option for your organization. I think that's one of the areas that people get caught up in, is that think buying a brand is actually going to solve their problem, whereas buying a software that suits their requirements probably gives them better bang for their buck.
Right. Yeah, makes total sense. Now, I want to make a comment here, or actually refer to a comment here from Ghassan, and I'm going to lead into a question from Ghassan as well over on LinkedIn. He said, such a fun topic, yet could open up a Pandora's box if a wrong decision is made. And that's a great point. If you go down that wrong path, or if you get started down the wrong track, the wrong path on the roadmap, that's not a good fit for your organization, doesn't meet your objectives and needs, or whatever the case may be, that can be a big challenge for certain. But then his kind of his follow-up comment to that is, people first, process second, both in green, then let's talk about software selection. So I think it's an interesting point, and I tend to agree with this, but we'd be curious to hear what the others here on the panel think, as far as that people first, process second, then you select the software. Maybe help us unpack that a little bit. First of all, do you agree with it? If you do agree, or if you don't agree, what are some of the nuances of that? What are your thoughts, Khalid? Maybe I'll start with you, since you're on camera now.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep. We can.
I think it's important to, number one, realize, and I say this, I don't know how many times a week, but it's very important. These are not IT projects. These are business related projects. And it's very important that you have an organizational frame for how you're going to attack organization-wide software, because people are the ones that are impacted. They're impacted first, and technology has a way of impacting those individual processes. And so naturally, you do want to think about people. You do want to think about the processes and how the individual software that you're either evaluating and ultimately selecting will impact those two measures, because that's where you're going to get the greatest form of ROI, which is where we're trying to push you here at Third Stage. But also you're going to get the greatest disruption if things go south. So I think it's a great way to view it.
Yeah, absolutely. How about?
Yeah. If I might comment, the Ghassan always has such great comments too. I love the Pandora's box idea, right? But if you're not taking this from a business process standpoint or view, you're really missing the opportunity to get the, as Khalid said, the strongest return on investment, and actually the lowest cost of ownership. And it's also going to be bringing the people along that are using the software on a daily basis, right? So looking at people, process, and then technology is really the way to fold it into a comprehensive project that cuts across all of those pieces.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It sort of gives you that blueprint or that roadmap organizationally for how technology can fit into the business going forward. But too often we get enamored by all the cool bells and whistles and all the great, cool stuff that these software vendors are creating, which is great. It is great stuff. But at the end of the day, that stuff doesn't really matter. The only stuff that matters within that is what supports your business, your people, and your processes, and where you're trying to head as an organization for sure. Great. So a lot of times, and I'll start with you on this one, Greg, because I know this is something you're passionate about. But a lot of times, organizations when they come to us, they'll say we want help with our digital strategy and our enterprise software selection, and oftentimes that mindset is by enterprise software or enterprise technology, we mean single ERP system, a single system that can handle all of our needs, or at least most of our needs, a core ERP system. That's what we mean by enterprise software selection. But that's not the only option out there. There's a lot of different options available in the marketplace, in addition to sort of your traditional single ERP systems. In addition to ERP, what are some of the common types of software and technologies that organizations can or should be considering as part of their roadmap?
Well, that's a great question. And frankly, when we're looking at enterprise operations, you look at the way that your organization operates today, it's not a single ERP system. It's not a single vendor that's providing all of that process, right? That enablement. It's a number of different technologies that work together. So in looking at a digital transformation, you really are looking at transforming your enterprise operations, including a number of technical deployments and systems that have to work together. There are a lot of interoperability considerations between different systems and components of the software solution that you're going to have to look at working together. There are numerous technologies out there like Palantir that actually provides an interoperable layer that can bring a lot of those disparate systems together. Many organizations are considering best of breed at this point, which might include 2 or more enterprise solutions for HCM, for finance and supply chain. You also have to integrate systems like manufacturing execution. So MES systems need to factor into that. There is data and analytics. So putting together a data lake and analytics platform like Snowflake and some of the other options that are out there for dashboarding and reporting need to factor into that entire digital strategy, right? That overarching transformation that you're looking to manage through the entire organization. And so there are a lot of other platforms and systems that need to work together. And I've just named a few, but there are many more. The other panelists have run into to many of these other platforms as well. Wayne, I think that you've had a lot of experience with that.
Yeah, and I think in the old days we could just put in our solution, whereas now we end up with more of a stack. And like you talk about, if we want more information, then a business analytics layer may be the case, so data lake and using that sort of approach, or those areas where best of breed, where we're actually looking for something that gives us connectivity, whether it be something that's we want standard, we want to work with, and then we want some competitive advantage in the way we actually configure other modules or other suites of products. And so it allows us to be able to get much more functionality for our organization if we consider some of those ways of doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, here's a question just building, and Greg and Wayne, and on what you just said. Here's a question that builds on this. This is from John over on YouTube. John asks the question here of, would you include machine data systems as well? Devices and software that capture real-time data from operational technology assets. That's something, this whole Industry 4.0 concept that a lot of manufacturers are pursuing, and really trying to leverage Internet of Things and devices on the shop floor to really consolidate some of that data. What are your thoughts on that, not just within manufacturing, but what other sorts of outlying technologies that could be critical to a digital transformation or an enterprise software selection? What other technologies along those lines have you guys seen, or maybe other industry examples?
Well, there's a big trend towards IT, OT conversion, it coming together as such. And so it's that thing where we are getting information from machines that are operating, either performing, manufacturing, whatever they might be doing, and actually identifying how well they're doing that, and so then incorporating it into our systems to be able to either see how well we're producing or what's causing some of those issues. And so it was one of the things where there was a line between them, whereas today technology's moved to the point where we can bring that information in and actually make it usable for us to actually change the way we operate, change the way we maintain, change the way we manufacture. And it's often it's about trying to get information that is usable, because you can get information overload if we try and bring everything in. But it's about understanding what we actually need to actually make those better decisions. And that's some of the challenges when we talk about machine data systems.
Yeah. Yeah. And Greg, I know you've worked within the healthcare industry, which I suspect has a similar sort of interoperability potential, with multiple types of systems. Maybe you could unpack that a bit just to talk about what are some of those major systems that healthcare organizations, just as an example, are considering as part of their digital strategies.
Huge consideration in healthcare. To your point, the clinical systems, Epic, Cerner, provide a lot of information that needs to be accessed and really acted upon within the enterprise system. So be it human capital management, supply chain, or finance, the information coming from the clinical systems is imperative to have interoperable within those systems. CRM is becoming very important in healthcare as well. So the integration and interoperability of all of those systems, bringing all of that information together, you've got such a huge haystack of data within an organization, especially in healthcare. Being able to find the needle in that haystack and then report on that so that you can take actionable steps if things are changing with the organization is facilitated by a lot of the new interoperability pieces that are available. Palantir is just one of those, but there are some others out there as well.
Right.
And Khalid is really kind of our integration and interoperability expert. So I might turn to him a little bit.
I think it's a great question. I think that, and it's something to really look at. I believe data is the lifeblood of ERP systems, and nowadays, for those kinds of things, the real question for me is where you're going to do it. A lot of ERP systems aren't positioned to analyze a lot of machine data, a lot of analytical data. You have to understand ERP systems are primarily transactional, not necessarily analytical frames. And so you really can get into your solution architecture and your cloud structure, and you're getting into what kind of associations, what kind of meaningful pieces of information you need to pull out of the data that you gather. But systems in general, the cloud structure is set up to pull data, and so you can get it out, whether you're dealing with machines on the shop floor, whether you're kind of dealing with something a little more complex. If you need to even run algorithms, there's predictive elements to a lot of ERP systems now that they're trying to loosely trying to incorporate. And so it's a matter of where you're storing this information, what do you need from this particular information, and how you're going to pull it. And a lot of it kind of usually nowadays goes back to a best of breed scenario of using different tools to be able to extract from there the kinds of information, pieces of information that you need.
Yeah, it's a great point. And there's a follow-up question I wanted to ask here on behalf of one of the attendees here. Actually, this one I'll come back to you again, Khalid, on this one, just because I know this is an area of passion for you, and Nate, you might have some good feedback on this too. But what about you mentioned before? You talked a little bit earlier. I think you mentioned it sort of in passing, Khalid, about ROI and getting business value. What about the ROI figures? And this is from Slava over on LinkedIn, by the way. He asked, what about the ROI figures? What is the best practice? In most scoping sessions of ERP selection, I have never seen actual calculations. So
a lot of people don't do it. I wish they would. I wish more people would do more business cases. We kind of get, we see a lot of, it's off and on. We'll see different clients want business cases, but I almost wish every client wanted a business case, because why wouldn't you build a business case for a massive investment like software? I would say best practice is to treat it like capital budgeting, really drive in and try to understand where your savings are, where your value is. Some years it'll be different per client, so it's not like it's a standard across the board. One ERP system may enable an organization to utilize a new revenue channel, as an example, that currently they can't access because they're on an antiquated system. So that revenue stream then becomes a part of the model for driving how much return you're going to get on something like this. There may be missed opportunities in the case of, you're using an ERP system that is causing you to, lose customers, or clients, or you're not able to upsell them in ways that you want. That is a revenue stream. So once you put all of the different pieces that combine your company's unique sort of circumstance and what is going to drive additional revenue year over year, now you sort of have a case or a setup for what this is going to cost and how much value you're going to kind of get out of that from a capital budgeting kind of perspective. And then you can just calculate your value kind of from there in a more traditional format. And that'll start to set up the case for how much this really makes sense for your organization over the course of a 5-year or a 10-year term.
Yeah, absolutely. How about you, Nate? Anything you'd add to that as far as business case and ROI, how to determine business benefits or potential business value in a software selection?
Well, I think that the important thing, and Khalid hit on it a little bit, but I think it is really important to sit down and say, is there a return on investment? And if there isn't clearly a return on investment, it doesn't have to be a lot, but if you're not going to gain from implementing a software, then don't do it. There's time is on your side. If you can't make a business case for it now, maybe wait till later. But I think also to add to that, I would say that it's real important though to sit down. The tangibles are very easy to figure out. We'll save from retiring this software. We'll save from human capital, that sort of thing. But it's also the intangibles. What markets and what analytics are going to allow us to do in the future to put us in a position to really make ourselves better as an organization and follow through with our vision. So I think it's important, even if it's at a very high level, do your ROI. If it doesn't make sense to do it now, put the project on the shelf till later. But then again, also sit it there and think about what those intangibles are, because that's often where organizations really kind of breeze over what the benefits are from a new system that can really be a game changer for an organization.
Yeah, and one of the things from the audience, this is a really good point I wanted to bring up related to the whole business case concept here, and that is really getting in. This is from Fernando on LinkedIn. And Fernando talks about ROI calculations in a business case. What should be done is to continually validate that these initial equations are maintained over time and ensure that the new software continues to meet the strategic and commercial objectives of the company. And so I think what Fernando's hitting on here is a really good point, which is the business case should be used to, of course, validate and justify a potential investment in technology. But even more importantly, I would argue, is what Fernando is saying, which is that same business case should also be used to drive the actual business value and the business benefits to ensure that you're getting the value you expected. Because just deploying the technology itself is not going to ensure that you get the business case or realize the business case. In fact, most of the time, you're not going to get it right away until you modify and tweak and fine-tune the way you've deployed technology, the way you're incorporating business processes into the system, the way you've handled change management. All that stuff should sort of point back to the business case. And so I think this is a really interesting point, this whole concept of benefits realization and business value realization as well. Nate, maybe I'll ask you a follow-up just because you're also one of our change management gurus, but kind of building on what Fernando mentions here as far as a business case being used as a tool to drive business value. How does organizational change management factor into the software selection process, as well as just ensuring that you get business value once you've selected and implement the software?
Well, I think it's important, and the point was brought up earlier. We are constantly talking about people, process, and technology. So I think it's really important to think about when you're going through a selection project and when you're entering into an initiative like this. No software is going to improve an organization in itself. There's the people that use the software. There's the processes that support the people to make the decisions in their jobs. So I think it's really important to look at this holistically and say, we really need to sit down and say, where are we going in the future? How are we going to get there? And how is this software going to help us? And then take a step back and say, do we have the right processes in place? Do we have the right people in place now to use the technology currently as it stands, and what the technology will enable us to do in the future? And that's really tough for storm organizations to make that leap, because you're so used to what you do on a day-to-day basis. And for some people and some organizations, they're using technology that's 15, 20 years past due. So it's really sitting down and saying, okay, how do we need to change the way we do business? Do we need to put new skill sets in front of our people that are working with the technology, or do we need to hire new people that are going to enable us to take better advantage of this technology? And then really put that third piece of the puzzle together and say, okay, now that we know our processes, now that we have the right people in place, what's going to be the best technology to get us to where we want to go?
Right.
And if I can add to that, Eric, it's important to think about these things holistically, because especially when you incorporate like a business case for something like this. I had mentioned a revenue channel, but to that particular point, if you can't implement the requirements that are going to unleash that particular revenue channel, then it's really not a part of your business case. So it really kind of brings me back to the fact that software selection is connected to the actual implementation itself, and that this whole frame is organization. You have to manage this process of bringing in software to your organization and then ultimately executing on it. And part of that execution is making sure, and this is really a third stage case, which is why I want to emphasize, is making sure that the reasons you brought in this software are what is actually being implemented. I think that connection has to be managed. And when you don't manage that, then you kind of get into a scenario where you're making assumptions that may or may not be the case.
Yeah. I think in addition to that, adding that view that, if we're putting in technology, and where we're bringing the change management piece is bringing people back in to use that technology. And often the reason we're actually going to go buy some new technology is people, are using a lot of workarounds, they're using all spreadsheets, and they're using those sorts of things. And the source of truth that we actually work off isn't really there. And so it's about, working back towards how do we use technology and change pieces, getting people to actually trust and work with the processes and actually use that technology. And that's where you drive value as well, because that's how you actually get information to be able to make those better decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great point. I want to come back to a question from Kyler on LinkedIn. And this is a great question, but it seems like in a software selection, understanding integrations, requirements, data organization, management can be really confusing, especially with vendors and system integrators that are trying to sell you something. How do you ensure that you're getting unbiased feedback during the software selection process? What are your guys' thoughts on that?
Can I take that one? Because it's an interesting one in the sense that when we talk about, instead of enterprise, we actually have a number of different vendors that are supplying us a stack as such, and so no one vendor actually sells you. And so, and often what we find, vendors are limited to what they know, not necessarily what the whole stack is going to look like. And so it is difficult to be able to get that information. And so you need to probably make sure that you're covering all of the stack you've got, not just limit it and then expect the rest to actually take care of itself.
Yeah.
That's a great point. I'll just, if I may weigh in a little bit, the point that Wayne makes about bringing together, a number of different vendors. Vendors will tell you exactly what they know about the software that they own and they are bringing to you. You have to have really a third party that's working directly for you, with you, on your behalf, to help cut through some of that information and make sense of everything that's needed to be brought together as a holistic approach. And I think that's one of the things that we've seen, especially recently, with our clients that are going down the road of digital transformation, looking at a number of different software systems, but really needing to understand how all of those fit together and can benefit the organization in the total transformation. So,
Right.
just that comment.
Yeah, I also would like to add, it's important to understand it's a vendor's job to be biased. I mean, they're going to be biased. You have to work with them because you want their expertise in the application that you're bringing into your organization. They have a hard view about these things. I think that question really gets you, and there's multiple schools of thought in this, and we deal with this sort of question all the time as you're trying to transition from selection to implementation. But for me, it's very important to have a perspective. A lot of the times organizations don't, and they walk into, okay, we have this software, we like this group, and they walk into those conversations with an implementer and they don't have a full perspective of what they want to do. And it's very important that you have a full perspective, not just in terms of what requirements you want to implement, but what you want that design to kind of look like, how you want that stack to sort of function. What we were just talking about as related to cloud and as related to machine, and do you want some of that machine data to sort of be incorporated within certain systems? You want that, you want to understand that before you talk to a software vendor, because the reality may be that this particular software may not have a great plan for dealing with machine data. Doesn't necessarily mean that that software isn't a great software for you. It just means that there's a gap between what you want to do and what the software of choice actually does. And the question that we like to deal with is, how are you going to mend that gap? You know, this does 95% of what you want it to do. How are you going to deal with this 5%? When you have plans across the board for what you want to do as an organization, dealing with vendors is easy because you already know where you want to, what box you want to kind of keep them in. And you understand you're going to use a different box for this other part where you either have to do a workaround or you have to do some sort of integration or some sort of process to kind of deal with an aspect of data or process or whatever it is that you're dealing with as an organization, that you have to deal with this offline, or you have to deal with this outside of the system of choice. And there's nothing wrong with that, because organizations deal with this all the time. So going into these conversations with a plan is, I believe, something very, very important. I wish more people would do it. We try to convince our clients to sort of do that all the time. Sometimes we have more success than others, but it's very, very important. And that way you can be in front of the conversations with the vendor and how you want things to function, rather than in a reactionary space where everything they're telling you, you're just agreeing with because you don't have a formalized thought around how you want to deal with this aspect of your business.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. And actually just building on this whole thread that we're on too, and it sort of gets back to the how we go about the actual evaluation process itself. And this question is from Kyler as well over on LinkedIn, and also our podcast co-host. She asks, who should manage a selection project within an organization to ensure interoperability is achieved? So if you look at sort of a cross-functional evaluation process that presumably is going to touch multiple parts of an organization, who should own that process? I mean, as we talk about sort of roles and responsibilities, who needs to own the selection process within an organization, or which people, if it's more than one person?
Anybody but procurement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is a great point, Wayne. And I think these projects are traditionally owned by the IT group, but I think there's far too many times we see organizations that let the IT group not only own the project, but run the project and run the outcome. I think it's important that it's owned by finance and IT, but it's led by a steering committee that has cross-functional representation from all the different work streams or all the different divisions, functions, whatever you want to call it. It's really important to note that, this is a huge IT initiative. You need their technical understanding. You need to know where this fits in with all the other platforms, but really everyone has to have say, and everyone has to have a chance to show how their requirements are going to be met with the new platform. So any of those one organizations or any of those ones divisions gets too much say and too much power in this selection, then you're gonna really set yourself up for failure.
I think Nate's hitting it on the head, but it really does come down to governance and steering, and the executive level of the organization really needs to set the pace, the entire decision going forward. But they have to have input from both IT and the business. So an opportunity, and we're seeing this all of the time with our clients, where business and IT have to work together, and they have to go up through those governance structures that are put in place so that decisions can be made rapidly and follow guiding principles with solutions that fit everyone up the organization. Just start with that executive decision to even start the selling process and move forward toward the organizational goals that you have for improving the way that you operate, improving the way that you deliver care in the case of healthcare. Your movements to come through that entire hierarchy of the organization from a governance standpoint, and need to put that in place right up front.
Yeah, you've got a lot of different stakeholders, a lot of different potentially differing opinions on what the right technology or roadmap is going to look like. How do you ensure alignment? If you're dealing with a cross-functional team of people that are making a decision of what the roadmap should look like, you're probably going to have diverse opinions, which is a good thing in general. But at some point, you've got to come to a consensus on what the path forward is. What are some of the challenges you guys have seen along those lines? I mean, maybe Nate or Khalid, it might be good for one of you guys to start us here on how you overcome that. How do you get that sort of consensus? You're not going to get unanimous decisions or unanimous agreement and support in most cases, at least not right away. So how do you navigate diverse cross-functional groups like that to ensure that you're getting to a consensus?
I would say to start, and then Nate, you can you may have a differing opinion or the same, but you need rules. Especially as you get closer to an actual implementation. When you're in the heart of an implementation, there's usually risk, escalations that are happening, problems that are occurring, and you want to have a way of navigating through what do we do when this happens, and do we go to level one? There's a level one response, there's a level two response, and you can kind of sort 3, 2, 1, or however you want to kind of word the final level of risk. And maybe that final level is you take it to either the executive sponsor or someone kind of above that, right? But there's different levels. It doesn't have to get to that point. There's a level under that, and there's a level under that. And so there's a broad agreement that a group has to come to with respect to how we're going to make decisions, how we're going to deal with problems, how are we going to deal with the inevitability that happens in projects. And the more you have that charter, when you have that, those rules in place, those escalations, I think you kind of get into less bickering and more in sort of a natural flow, right? That should include kind of a cadence. And you can use this selection as a trial run to kind of put in part of that structure and run with it. And then as you get into implementation, it's not new. This is part of what you naturally do. And I think you'll have a solid foundation to have a successful implementation if you do that.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is no one's ever going to get everything they want in an implementation. And I think it's the more you can put a strong steering committee together that represents all aspects of the organization and come to an understanding that there is going to be give and take, and knowing that for the most part, finance and your governance and your controls are probably the most important thing. Once you do that and you sit down and and you really come to an understanding, it's just going to be give and take. And there's never, I don't think in my whole entire career I've ever seen an implementation where every group that's represented is 100% happy with the give and take that they're putting out there. But I think as you get a flow going and as the groups work closely together, they really can figure out that by giving a little here, it's going to benefit someone else within the organization. And that give and take really, becomes a part of the project.
Yeah, and if you have clear direction and leadership within the organization too, that always helps. I think a lot of times organizations struggle with that. They have the right intentions in that they want to get input from multiple stakeholders, want to try and make everyone happy if they can. But ultimately, you're not going to make everyone happy, and it's pretty rare that you see sort of a unanimous agreement on the right path forward, which is why you need that leadership or someone at the executive sponsor level to sort of set the vision for what this is going to be and make decisions and say, okay, here's why we're making this decision. Here's how it's going to benefit the organization, and really just laying out that case for change. A lot of times organizations don't do that because they want to take more of call it a bottoms up or more of a flat democratic approach to digital transformation. But there are times where you need, even if that is your style as an organization, you need that leadership and you need someone to step up and be that executive sponsor that can make those sorts of decisions as well. So that's an important part of the change component, in my opinion, too. Let's see. A couple of these questions we've already covered here. This is a funny comment from Ghassan, which I'd be curious to get your feedback on, other than whether you agree that it's funny or not. This is from Ghassan on LinkedIn again. He says, vendors promise the full moon during demos. Customer is delighted. Then the system integrator takes over and whoops, there's no moon, only a crescent. Ouch. So what are your thoughts? Is that something we've seen? It sort of gets back to that question earlier that Kyler had about how do you ensure that you are making decisions in an objective way and you're being realistic and that you have a clear vision of what reality is going to look like. What are your thoughts on that, Khalid?
I've been on that side. It makes me laugh because I was on the SI side and I was the guy trying to get to the crescent and get as far away from the moon as possible. Because there's two sides to this, right? So the first thing I'll do is defend the SIs first, right? And understanding what it is that they're doing and what their job is. It's very important to understand in an implementation, we're trying to get to success. No one, wants to go through and third stage has, Eric and Greg, we've all been a part of these ongoing expert witness kind of cases where there's this lawsuit in place. And when you see it, you kind of see these endless implementations that never get to a success. And nobody wants that. An SI doesn't want that. So naturally, what an SI does is they get these requirements and they're trying to skinny them down into a time and cost sort of space that makes sense for what it is that they're doing. And that is their job, to narrow scope. They're trying to narrow scope where they can as much as they can. And that's so that they can get to a success. It's okay if there's multiple phases. So they may, approach this and say, well, we can do this in phase one and this time. And then for phase two, we can get to these other parts. Maybe then we can naturally do that. That's where the crescent comes in. To me, the full moon is all your requirements. The crescent is the phase. So I'm trying to get you to what does phase one look like? What is reasonable? What can be achieved? What can we actually do? And so that's their job. And it's important. And this is kind of cuts into what I was mentioning earlier with respect to these things have to be managed, because if you don't manage them, it's so easy to lose track. Here, you're trying to have a conversation where you're trying to get to your ROI. The implementer is trying to have a conversation of how do they narrow things down and exit off the hard requirements and just implement the easy ones, right? So those are two different conversations. Those are two different levels. There's two different expectations there. So it's important to have proper balance and understand exactly what can we achieve now and why, have a plan in place for how you're going to roll these out. Are we going to roll this out for one company? Say you're a multi-entity. Let's say you have 5 different entities make up this one company. And as an implementer, you're trying to come in and say, well, we can't implement all 5 at once. for the following reasons. Maybe it makes sense for us to just do this one company, or maybe it makes sense for us to just do finance, and then we'll do the CRM part later, or that sort of thing. So you have to have an approach that makes sense. You have to have a plan that makes sense, not just for the implementers, but for you, for the client, for the organization, in terms of what their calendar year looks like, in terms of what their strategic goals are, what their long-term plans are. And those are competing interests. Those are naturally going to be competing interests. And so it's important that you manage these things from selection all the way through implementation. Understand what your key requirements are. Understand what's driving your business case for why you want to implement this thing in the first place. Make sure those parts are implemented. Make sure the people side of this is effectively implemented so that you can get to those benefits. But in the meantime, you're gonna have to go through a little chaos to get it. And part of that chaos is dealing with an implementer that is trying to narrow down scope into achievable chunks for you. And in the process, every chunk is going to be chaotic, right? So no one wants to go through 3 and 4 different phases, but sometimes that's the proper approach for your organization. So it's important to plan that, balance that, and be able to move forward through it.
But often the moon is created because, we ask the vendor to actually demonstrate the product, and they will show the best that they can show. Whereas if we drive the discussion and set the scripts and the scenarios that we're looking for to satisfy our requirements, all of a sudden that moon becomes an achievable one than just the moon we can't touch. And I think that's sometimes where selection goes off the rails, is because, and the difficulty then is faced by the solution integrator, because we've said the software vendors set this wonderful picture because this is the best you can get, sort of thing, without really the organization narrowing it down and saying, well, here's what our requirements are, demonstrate those for us, because that's what makes sense to us. And then we get to the point where that is actually a bit closer to be deliverable. And so that's often where we see the difference.
Yeah. Traditional systems integrators too work with usually a single vendor. And as we've talked throughout the discussion, enterprise solutions can include many different systems, many different vendors. And so you may have 3 or 4, very certified, very, very adept teams implementing different aspects of the software. Bringing those all together under thoughtful and holistic program management is really an important part of this success, going from selection to deployment. And you don't always get the full moon, right? You get a 3/4 moon that is appropriate for your business, for your organization.
And just building on that point you made there, Greg, I wanted to ask, once you have selected software, and I guess there's 2 dimensions of selecting software, 2 major dimensions. One is, what is the technology that we're going to deploy? Secondly is, how are we going to deploy it? What does the roadmap look like? What resources do we need? What's the budget? All that stuff. Can you talk to a little bit about how, assuming we've already picked the technology, we have a pretty good sense of what technology we want to deploy. What is it we do next? We've made the decision. Let's just assume we've procured the software. Do we just jump in and start implementing? What do we do? How do we get started on an implementation journey that sort of allows us to transition out of that selection phase, but be successful as we transition into implementation?
I think there's something that goes along in parallel with the selection. As you're getting down to your vendor of choice or vendors of choice, you really need to take the organization through what we call a phase 0, which is preparedness of the organization for both, as Nate says, people, process, and technology to move forward into that implementation, right? You've got data cleansing activities that need to occur. You've got the organization communications that need to happen internally to let everybody know what's going on, a very vital part of change management. You've got to do your training planning. So you've got to understand when people are going to need to know what in order to do their jobs with the new system, right? So all of that can be a length of time that spans both the selection and pre-implementation of a matter of months to 16, 18 weeks. But you have to have that preparedness piece. And that is the transition to the full implementation that goes on.
Yeah. And I think, if there's sort of leading into sort of a closing point or sort of a capstone question here for the panel. Um, it seems like a couple of takeaways here that I've taken away from the discussion is one is you want an objective evaluation. You want to be agnostic. You want to be smart, and you want to be looking at the right technologies that are good fits for your organization, but you want to be doing that in a way that's technology agnostic. And then once you've done that, once you've identified what the right technology or technologies are for your organization, then to your point, Greg, you want to transition into this implementation readiness, the phase zero, to make sure that now you lay out a clear and realistic plan, budget, strategy, change management plan and strategy, all that stuff that's required to be sort of a blueprint and a foundation for the actual implementation. Those are two of the main takeaways I had. But what other sorts of takeaways would you leave the audience with here today, as they think about their software evaluation journeys and the process? What are some of the biggest couple takeaways that you'd leave with the group here? Why don't we start with you, Nate?
I think that my biggest takeaway is sit down, get the right people involved from the beginning, get a vision, and really sit down. Once you have your vision, where you want to be and how the technology will help get you to where you want to be, then sit down, put the right team in place, put a realistic and detailed plan in place for how you're going to make your decisions, when you're going to make your decisions, and who are going to make the decisions, and really be realistic about where it is that you want to be in a year. Do you want the software implemented? And then work backwards and say, is this something that we really can do?
Yeah, it's good advice. How about you, Wayne?
I agree, Nate. I think one of the things is know what good looks like at the beginning, so that when you actually work through those decisions as they come up, you're actually making them on the basis of where are we heading, sort of thing. And so that readiness piece is important, because what are we trying to achieve? How is the whole organization going to get there and make those decisions? And so understanding where you're heading is a good start, and knowing that before you actually are heading there is always a good thing. Take the map before you go on the journey, sort of thing.
Yeah, that's good advice. How about you, Khalid? What would you leave the audience with here? Is it one or two takeaways or key things to keep in mind as you start a selection process?
Well, I would say first, implementations are chaotic, and I've never really been a part of one. And I've done a bunch. I've never been a part of one that wasn't chaotic. Even when they're smooth, there's a certain amount of chaos that's built into it. The way, though, that you really get through an implementation is by being organized. And being organized early in the process matters. And so that's where the software selection part really kicks in, and understanding your business, understanding what you want out of the process, understanding what deliverables you're really trying to drive for prior to an implementer and SI kind of walking through the door saves you time, money, and effort in the long term. And it's very important that you do to sort of manage through to manage through the chaos that's coming with implementations.
Yeah, that's well said. And then how about you, Greg? Last but not least, what takeaways would you leave the audience here with on how to get started, or lessons to keep in mind?
Just understanding that when you're going into this, not to repeat everything that everyone said, great points from the panel, but the objective of a digital transformation, right, is to improve and achieve goals within the organization that you have for that digital transformation, for automation of process, everything that you have going forward. So to start with that in mind, holistically, and look at different systems comprising your enterprise operations and how they work together, and very good alignment with your executive team is the important first step.
Yeah. Yep. No, that's great stuff. And I would add just one more to the list, which is to leverage outside technology agnostic help where appropriate. That's where companies like Third Stage, like our company, can help. This is a big part of what we do with our clients, is helping them objectively and technology agnostically evaluate and select the right software for the organization, and then ultimately we help them implement those solutions as well. So I think that's the key thing. Another key takeaway too is just to be agnostic and have that outside agnostic expertise to help you through the process. It'll speed things up and certainly make things more cost effective and more realistic along the way as well. So I want to thank you all for being here today. I know you guys are joining from all over the world. In Greg's case, from an airport. Wayne's all the way in Australia. We're all the way in the U.S. The rest of us are all the way in the U.S. I really appreciate everyone being here today. I appreciate the panel joining too. We've got a great discussion here from the audience. I want to thank the audience as well. We had a great discussion from the audience and appreciate that. Again, this interview will be part of the Transformation Ground Control podcast that gets released a week from tomorrow. And you can find new episodes of that show every Wednesday on all the audio podcast platforms that are out there, as well as on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. And then every Tuesday, we do these live streams as part of our production of that podcast. So thank you all for being part of that. I want to thank everyone for being here. I hope you all have a great week in the meantime, and we'll see you next time. Take care.